I think the contemplative mind is the most absolute assault on the secular worldview that you can have. Because it really is a different mind. What I'm going to call the calculative mind, or the calculating mind. It's the egocentric mind that reads everything in terms of personal advantage, in terms of usually short-term effect, in terms of what's in it for me and how will I look and how will I look good. As long as you read reality from that small self and read everything calculatively, I don't think you're going to see things in any really new way. What all the great religions have talked about is a different way of seeing that is actually a different perspective, a different vantage point, a different starting point. I use often Albert Einstein's quotes. He said, "No problem can be solved by the same consciousness that caused it." Now what we're trying to do is solve our problems by the same consciousness that caused them. Which read everything in terms of cause and effect and personal advantage. The word contemplation really only became popular again through really Thomas Merton's writings in the 50s and 60s. Probably a lot of religions use the word meditation. Actually, the word most Christians are familiar with is simply the word prayer. But the word prayer became, unfortunately, in the West, like everything did in the West, became something functional, something you did, again, to achieve a desired effect, which puts you back in charge. As soon as you make prayer a way to get something, and listen to most prayers, that's what they are, and it's okay. I think God's used to it by now. But it's really not any kind of new state or new consciousness. It's the same old consciousness. How can I get God to do what I want God to do? So maybe I'll talk to him about it, Cure my grandma, Well, I guess if he gets enough, he's probably counting, or she's probably counting. How many cure my grandmas do I get? And if I get enough of them, I'll do it. But that's where most people are at with prayer. It's not really a change of consciousness. It's the egocentric self deciding what it needs and what it wants and resorting to what we now call a higher power, because you can't get any better than that to get on your side, to get what you want. So you can basically remain an untransformed, egocentric person who's just now, instead of manipulating everybody else, which is all the ego can do, is it now tries to manipulate God. Now that's why at least one reason I think religion is in such desperate straits today. Because it really isn't transforming people. It's merely giving people some pious and religious ways to again be in charge and to again be in control. It's still the small self. And what a genuine religion is talking about is a transformed self. It's a different I. Paul uses that wonderful phrase, I live no longer, not I. It's a different I, a different sense of self that's here. I think until you've come to that, you're not at foundational transformation. You might be pious, you might be denominational, you might be religious in the way the term is normally used. You might belong to some group, but it's still what we'll call the small self. And that's okay. That's how you got to get started. As the psychologist would say, you got to have an ego to let go of an ego. You got to have a self to move beyond the self. But what most religion does is it stops at that first function of simply giving you a positive self-image. That I'm a religious person, or I'm a moral person, or I'm a dedicated person, or whatever it might be. This function of religion does not usually or necessarily change the level of consciousness in a person. It does not deliver radical transformation. It does not deliver a shattering liberation from the separate self. It consoles the self, fortifies the self, defends the self, and promotes the self. Now he says, as long as the separate self believes the myths, performs the rituals, mouths the prayers, embraces the dogma, then the self, it is fervently believed, will be saved. We're not really sure what that's supposed to mean, but everybody uses the word rather glibly, being saved. I suppose in most Western Christians' mind, it means going to heaven. That I'm going to get some reward later for doing this. And the whole thing is, I always call it a very bad reward-punishment novel. Life is a giant reward-punishment system. And if you jump the hoops right, you'll get the reward. It's not about transformation. Can you feel the difference? You don't have to be transformed. You just have to play the game right. And this is what we're dealing with today. Now he goes on, and he says, religion has also served in a usually very, very small minority. His analysis is pessimistic. The function of radical transformation and liberation. This function of religion does not fortify the separate self, but utterly shatters it. Not consolation, but devastation. Not entrenchment, but emptiness. Now, this is why your great spiritual teachers will always talk about descent, the way of the cross, emptiness, letting go. Not complacency, but devastation. Not entrenchment, but emptiness. Not complacency, but explosion. Not comfort, but revolution. In short, not a conventional bolstering of consciousness, but a radical transmutation and transformation of consciousness at its deepest level. That is what we mean by religious conversion. Now, how that normally happens is by what we'd call a God encounter, where your natural egocentricity is undercut. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't make sense anymore. In other words, you have to find a center outside of yourself that is in fact the center. Up to that point, you're eccentric, and you're off-center, and most people are eccentric. You're not the center of the world at all, but you act as if you are. Everything is, do I like it? Do I want it? Do I look good? Is my name on it? Now, what I'm going to do is try to give you two different diagrams. So we can understand this. It almost takes a simple imaging of it. But I'm going to call this the false self. Now this is, I'm afraid, what we're doing a lot of times is we're baptizing the false self, we're ordaining the false self, we're giving communion to the false self. The false self is this little autonomous thing over here that tries to dress itself up, fortify itself, as we just make itself look Christian or Catholic or religious or whatever it wants to be, or moral. Now, people like Jesus come along, and in the presence of that, they say, unless the grain of wheat die, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it will bear much fruit. Or he'll say, the branch cut off from the vine is useless. That's a really strong statement. It's useless. He goes even further. He says, you might as well throw it into the fire. It's a waste of time working with this thing. And yet that's exactly what we're doing. He's largely working with this false self. And the way we start, we all start here, there probably, and God certainly understands this, is we gaze at our navel and see, are we doing it right? And the question always is, how do I get over here? Now, over here, I guess you could call this God, heaven, eternity, the truth, the mystery. And the question is, what are the rules, what are the rituals, what are the practices that I can perform to get God to like me? That's where, in effect, everybody starts. They wouldn't put it in those words, all right? But everybody does. And it's an okay starting place. It's just not a good continuing place. And it's a terrible ending place. Now, I want to right away, because we're going to jump back and forth to understand these, because this is necessary, by the way, to understand contemplation and the contemplative mind, we're going to draw the true self. This is the only self that's ever existed. It's the only self that exists right now. The trouble is, most people don't know it. They really don't. And the work of religion is to get you to know this. Religio, the very word means to rebind, to reconnect. You came forth from God. Your deepest DNA is divine. You are not human beings trying to become spiritual. That's how everybody starts. You are already spiritual beings. And the profound question is how to be human. I believe that's why Jesus came as a human being. Not to teach us how to go to heaven, to teach us how to be a human being here on this earth. Can you imagine how different the history of Western Christianity would have been if we would have concentrated on teaching Christians how to be human beings in this world? Instead of all this heaven talk. Remember I said in the first prayer, it's all about now, about how you do it now. We took all the power out of the now, and we put all the power into the future. Everything was a reward, punishment, was going to happen later. And so now was sort of a game, or an obstacle course, or a testing ground. But you really didn't take it in itself seriously. It's all play acting, and hopefully playing it right so that you get the reward later. So here I have the small self, and you can call it that if you want. Psychologically, Jung would call this the small self and call this the great self with a big S. When the small self knows that it has no meaning, no foundation, apart from who it is in God, that's transformation. When I live, no longer, not I. You see, that is a different experience of the self. Just as you have a heart transplant, this is an identity transplant. Just as you have a lung transplant or a liver transplant, it is I can't say it's strong enough, it's a different sense of the I. A different sense of the self. A different sense of the who that you are. I always love to say, excuse me, we got to get the who right. Who are we? Who are we? And most people don't know. They think they are this private self. This Richard thing, this Ben thing, this Judy thing, this Susan thing, all of which is fine. But Merton says it so well. He says, one thing for sure about heaven, there won't be much of you there. In other words, the you that you think is you, this little thing, now this is secular consciousness. This is the world we live in today. This is what people, that's all you have. And so you have to dress it up. You have to defend it. You can make a pretty general statement. Whenever you're defensive, it's always the false self. This self is so secure, it never has any, it doesn't have any, there's nothing to defend, if you follow me. There's nothing to be offended. And I tell many people, that's how you know you're living in the false self at that moment, if you take offense at anything. If you took offense in the kitchen at Tepeyac this morning because someone didn't clean up after themselves. I mean, I probably would have too. But don't do it for more than 15 seconds, you know. Because for more than 15 seconds, that's just your little insecure self that needs to be pampered or needs to define itself by cleanliness or whatever it might be, or order, you know. This self is pretty unoffendable. It really is. It's just, I can see why the Bible said, don't let the sun go down on your anger. You'll get angry for a few minutes, but you can't identify with it. You can't feed it. You don't let it possess you, as I said last week. Now, the rules here are sort of the rules of what I'm going to call requirement religion. It's always looking for what are the correct requirements. And every religion is convinced that it has the correct requirements. It forces you toward legalism and ritualism eventually. Here, it's not about requirements, it's about relationship. The quality and your capacity for relatedness. Now, I hope you can see how I'm laying the foundation for contemplation. Because this self will say prayers, but this self is a prayer. Just by walking from here to there. it is a prayer. Now that's why Paul can say something like, pray always. He can't mean walking around saying Our Fathers and Hail Marys, huh? But how you can pray always is when you live in conscious union with God. It's really not, this is the surprise for most people, it's really not about being perfect. This self will still make mistakes, but it lives from a center other than its own. Now, until and unless you've met a centered person, a grounded person who you can tell their center is outside themselves, it's almost hard to get the feel for this. You have to have met a saint. In fact, my definition of Christianity in recent years has been a Christian is someone who's met one. That this whole thing is contagious. Huh? When you meet a person of a certain quality of maturity, that's how you get maturity. Yeah? You meet a patient person and you learn how to be patient. You meet a loving person, you learn how to be loving. That's the way human beings operate. You don't even know how to do it. Huh? And it's the same way with this. When you meet a really grounded, happy, free person, you can just feel the water rise. You become more like that because you'll be satisfied with nothing less. That becomes the reference point or the criteria. This whole thing spreads, like a contagion, really. But it spreads through relationship, by the quality of one's relationship. Now, what we'd say is happening in prayer is you're experiencing that quality of relationship with God, where you know you're not being manipulated, you're not being used, you're not being judged, you're not being evaluated. Boy, who wouldn't go there? I mean, that's just the place of ultimate freedom. That's the state that every one of us wants to live in. So that's why we tell people, go pray a half an hour a day or whatever it might be, because you live in this place. You become this. It's sort of that simple. It rubs off on you. I don't know what other way to say it. So I want to say as strongly as I can that all of the institutes of religion, Bible, sacraments, priesthood, churches, everything, rosary, way of the cross, contemplative, sit, is to help you experience this self. Pure and simple, that's all. And if your religion isn't helping you experience this self, then change it. Or get rid of it, or do something different. If it's maintaining you in this self, then we got a problem. And a lot of religion is. This is the religion that fought Jesus, because it was all into dogmatism and requirements. And when Jesus wasn't following their dogmas and requirements, they had to get rid of him. So if this is about requirement, this is not just about relationship, but it's about right relationship. How do you connect in a way that's really connection? This is about being correct. Do you see? Am I correct? Am I right? I always say you'd think the first commandment was, thou shalt be right. It's not about being correct, it's about being connected. Connected. Unless the vine is connected, or the branch is connected to the vine, we have a problem. Now, how does God achieve this? This is the process of transformation. What life will do to you anyway, but most people don't have the freedom to recognize it and to allow it. What life will do to you, and I'm going to use religious language and say God will do it to you, God has to, in the course of your years, destabilize that private ego. The word for that is suffering. Mental suffering, emotional suffering, physical suffering, relational suffering, things that you can't fix, that you can't control, that you can't explain, you can't change. There is no way, and you got to be honest at this point, your ego is not going to give up until it has to. You know that. You know that. It's not, as long as you're goody two-shoes and looking good and feeling good and everybody's admiring you and you're the best Catholic in Oregon, I mean, why would you change? You're feeling quite well without God, thank you. Oh, you're very pious. You're very religious, but you don't really need God. You're admiring your own advancement, your own maturity, so-called, you see. So God has to let you fail. Now, I always say, therefore, there are two people who have a head start in the spiritual life. Two groups of people, sinners and mystics. Mystics are those who, in this inner journey, consciously let go of those ego boundaries and collapse back in to who they really were anyway, but didn't know it. You are this right now, all right? That's all you've ever been, but hardly anybody knows it, do you see? And what you're doing in your contemplative sit is consciously experiencing that. Not knowing it through the head level, experiencing it through the body, gut level. It has to be experienced. You can't teach people this. Even though I'm trying to tell you right now, all right? You won't believe me. You will leave here and live just like you always did until you know this for yourself. And then it's not a matter of belief. I don't believe this. I know this. It's not a matter of, people think religion is believing unbelievable things. It is believing unprovable things. But these things can clearly be experienced. Where you know it, it's the only thing that finally makes sense of what's happening. So the real task, brothers and sisters, is far different. Here we thought it was how to get this over here. The real question is how to get from here to here, where you were anyway, but you didn't know it. All right? So it's all a matter of awakening. It's all a matter of awareness. Now this self is capable of contemplation. That's all. It's that simple. It will now read reality, not from this egocentric position. Remember how I started a few minutes ago? Has to read everything in terms of personal advantage and how do I look? And what will this gain me? Its center is over here. To use religious language, we'd say we don't look at things through our own eyes, but through the eyes of God. That's the truth. Now, it's a more panoramic seeing. It's a broader seeing. It can read reality in the way of wisdom. Wisdom, which is broad enough to absorb paradox and contradictions and inconsistencies. If this self is characterized by fragility, and it is, this self is very fragile. And it should be. Anything that doesn't exist should be fragile. This is characterized by abundance. That word has become very popular in recent years, and I think with good reason. And you feel that when you're around a grounded person, a sense of inner abundance, a sense of I've got plenty. They're not grasping, they're not protecting, they're not always needing more and counting how much did you get and how much did I get, which is all this thing here can do. There's no great freedom in being a liberal false self. Do you follow me? This is the freedom. Because here you don't have a lot to protect. Now that's why I said at the beginning, this is the ultimate assault on the secular mind, is religious transformation. These people can't be bought off by any system. They don't need its rewards. They're drawing their life from within. Almost everything you call sin, is really a symptom of sin. The fact that you are grasping and jealous and impatient means at that moment you're living out of this self. You follow me? That's all. It's not if you're grasping and impatient, I'm not going to like you, which is what most people think inside of the reward punishment thing. It's just you're not free yet. And those are the indications, the things that we call sin are the indications that you're not living here. I do want to say that life is a dance between the true self and the false self. I don't know anybody, including Mother Teresa, who lives 24 hours a day over here. She probably lived 23 and a half over here, you know. But I worked with her community in Calcutta 4 years ago, right after she died. And, I became aware of her little faults too. Thank God, it was such a relief to find out. Even Mother Teresa had little faults, just like you and I do, join the human race. We're all in this together. So she, did this dance too. It's okay to live in the false self. Now listen closely, just don't believe it. You follow me? Don't believe this thing. Don't offer it any incense. Don't kiss up to it. And don't expect other people to. Or you'll spend a life of total, upsetness, which is what most people do, just waiting to be upset. Because this thing is living on the edge of upsetness all the time. Huh? In fact, after you've lived here 40 years or so, like when you're my age, it's just, this thing is so, it knows it isn't there yet. It feels that foundational ungroundedness or insecurity. So you'll tend to see people dance faster and faster, become more rigid, become more demanding, more controlling. Most people my age are control freaks. Almost all of them are. Because that's the only way you can feel that some way you're in control, is to take control. This one doesn't, there's nothing to take control of because someone else is much better in control, and you know that experientially. You know that experientially. That someone else is in control anyway, and here the rules are trust and letting go and surrender. They're not about making it right. You don't need to push the river over here. You've got to push the river over there. So, in a certain sense, I always say when I'm teaching this that even me standing here right now, I'm living out of the false self in a certain way. I've got my hat of teacher on, and I'm fulfilling a role. Whenever you've got a role, you take yourself a little more seriously than you really need to. And that's all right. As long as, when this session is over, I can step off my podium and walk out the door and know who I am, apart from being the teacher. Do you see? And I don't need you to kiss up to this, and I don't need to take my own PR too seriously. Now, you've got to know that most people don't know how to do that. Now the spiritual word for that was attachment, that you become attached to this thing, because that's all you've got. Right? And if other people don't like it, or talk about it, or criticize it, you fall apart, or you become defensive, or even violent toward them, because that's all you've got. Is the defense of this thing that you've concocted and created and is going to die anyway. It doesn't mean a hill of beans. What happened, especially after the immense intellectual achievements of the West, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific, technological revolution, is we absolutely exploded the individual self. Nowhere has the individual self been so developed as in North America and Europe. Europe even more than here. And in a certain sense. And so I think that's why contemplative teaching is so important here, and also so very, very difficult for us. Because we just can't imagine letting go of this, because this is all we have anymore, you see? And what most self-help programs are today are giving you ways to teach this thing here how to cope. And coping mechanisms, right? Survival mechanisms for the false self. As we say, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, I mean, the whole thing is going down. It's a useless project. Now, as impatient and angry as I get at religion, why I can't give up on religion is because religion, healthy religion, is the only thing prepared to describe the movement from here to here. If you don't use God talk, I mean, why would you give up control? If there was not someone you trusted, that you could give up control to. The secular mind is burdened with creating control freaks. That's all you can produce in secular society. In fact, I always say, you'd be irresponsible not to be, wouldn't you? I mean, you have to see that everything's working and everything's right and everything's fixed. And you better, because no one else is going to do it. There's no sense that the universe is on my side, as some saying, that I'm already in the flow, that I don't have to push the river, I'm in the river. I don't have to create the story. The story is happening. And I'm now, the 6 billionth one on the planet right now to be living this story. And what is the story? It's death and resurrection. Every religion is saying that in one sense or another. It's all about death and resurrection and trusting it. Now, Jesus came to live that in a very living icon. Christ has died, Christ is risen. Trust the death, and that breaks you through to the resurrection. Now, this, if you've lived over here, listen closely, if you've lived over here for 40 years or 50 years, and this starts being destabilized, all right? You get your first big suffering at 50, a death in the family or something like that. You're going to fight it with everything you can. You're going to look for somebody to blame. You're going to look for somebody to attack. And it's going to feel like dying. It's going to feel like dying. If you haven't had training in dying, if you haven't had any training in letting go, and in trusting a bigger mystery, a bigger process, a bigger benevolence, a bigger pattern, use whatever word you want, you won't surrender to this. You will try even harder to be back in control. And that, I'm afraid, is an awful lot of older people. So this movement, back to who you already were, it will feel like letting go. It will feel like losing. Some have said that what Christianity is really about is how to lose graciously. So now maybe you can understand this passage from John in a whole new way. John 15, whoever remains in me, as I in them, will bear much fruit. That's what he's talking about. In fact, that's the language of all of the mystics, is the language of union. If it's not the language of union, don't trust it. So as I said before, it's all about getting the who right. And once you have the right who are you? That's the who are you? And just every day ask it of yourself again, who am I? You're a daughter of God would be the religious language, huh? A son of God. This is really my geometric way of imaging that religious language that we've grown up with. It's not so much what we do, but the who that is acting is what liberates and brings life to the world. And this person over here, I mean, if you're living in the true self at least an hour a day, you'll still make mistakes. You'll still do stupid things. That's why I say, it isn't about being a morally perfect person. I know I'm not. But you'd know it when you're doing it. And just you see it. You're not satisfied with it. You can apologize. You can admit you're wrong. This self has a pretty hard time admitting it's wrong. Because that's all it has, is its righteousness. Do you see? When Paul says, I have no righteousness of my own, but only the righteousness that comes from union with Christ Jesus my Lord. There it is. It's a different righteousness. Huh? It doesn't go up and down. It doesn't depend upon feelings. Huh? That's why they spoke of God being your rock, your Savior, your deliverer. This person is utterly solid and grounded. Huh? Their feelings don't go up and down each day depending upon who likes them. They're not, to use our contemporary term, they're not codependent. This self is very, very codependent. Needs constant feedback, affirmation, approval, incense. Offer me some incense, you know. This can get by with less and less because it's drawing its life from within. Happiness is an inside job, do you see? This will need more and more outside. Money, clothes, cars, right place to live, status symbols. It's just, you know, it's like the alcoholics say, you need more and more of what doesn't work. Whereas the saints, they need less and less to make them happy. It's really that simple. Their contentment is from within. They're not expecting the future to be any different than it is right now. Because how you do the now we're going to tie into contemplative practice. How you do anything is how you do everything. And if you're accessing the now, God, being, consciousness, what is, use whatever word you're comfortable with, it doesn't really matter. If you're accessing that right now, then you're going to have found the well springs of joy right now. And then you'll carry that into the future too. And if you can't believe that God is here right now, when you go to Mass or church tomorrow, God isn't going to be there either. Because you won't know how to access that moment any differently. So I always say that presence, and that's the key word now, presence is a relational term. Now what we're doing in contemplation, you're learning how to be present. That's really it. You're learning how to access what is. Now the reason most people run from it is because you know what comes up first? The garbage. Remember when it says the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness. And it says there he met the wild beasts. This is Mark 1:13-15. The Spirit drove him into the wilderness. There he met the wild beasts. And angels ministered to him. I'm afraid first what comes up is the garbage. That's why most teachers insist on at least 20 minutes. But you can assume, certainly the first half of any sit is just letting go of those thoughts that want to impose themselves on you, those judgments, those fears, those negations, that discomfort, that unprocessed conversation at breakfast, whatever it might be, all of that just keeps attacking you and assaulting you. So what you have to do is you have to become the watcher, where you step back from it and you see that judgment. Now that might sound to you at first like that's an intellectual game. It isn't. Do you see what's happening there? Is you're separating from it and you're letting it be over there. So now you know that feeling is not me. I'm over here watching it over there, which means it isn't me. Most people never do that. The feeling has them all the time. They never separate from it. And that's what it means to be possessed by a demon. The feeling has them. They feel they've got to have it. No, I don't have to have it. So Thomas Keating teaches this beautiful and almost simple boat exercise where he says, you sit on the bank of a stream, you observe each of your thoughts coming along saying, think me, feeling, saying, feel me, feel me. Acknowledge you're having the feeling. Acknowledge that you're having a thought. Don't hate it. Don't judge it. Don't critique it. Don't in any way move against it. But simply name it. Resentment toward so-and-so. Thought about so-and-so. Admit that you're having it. He says, place it on a boat and let it go down the river. The river is your stream of consciousness. Now that's what you're doing in the first stages of contemplation. This self can't do it because all it has is its own thoughts. Most people think they are their thinking. Right? Most people think they are their thinking. They don't have a clue who they are apart from their thoughts. What you're doing in contemplation is moving to a level beneath your thoughts, at the level of pure being, the level of really what we call pure consciousness, which is not consciousness of anything in particular. It's simply awareness. And now as soon as you think, I am doing this well, or I am aware, that's a boat. Or as soon as you think, oh, I'm doing this terribly, if he knew what I'm thinking about, this terrible thought I'm having, that's a boat too. Let go of that. That's the ego trying to judge itself. And it'll always do that. Trying to judge, and the only way the ego knows to do anything is up or down. Either I'm better or I'm worse than. It's always up or down. Critiquing. Men tend to compete, women tend to compare. But it's the same ego game. Trying to see whether I'm up or whether I'm down. In pure being, there's no up and down. There just is. There's no evaluation. It's just a delighting in a kind of spaciousness, a kind of freedom. Now those thoughts that come back for round 2 and round 3 and sometimes round 4 and 5, those are your compulsive patterns of thinking. Some of you are going to see that you have paranoid patterns of fearing what might go wrong. Some of you are going to have attack patterns of wanting to blame, change, fix, make things right. That's the type I am. And then there's some of you who are going to be the codependent types who are always, how am I looking? How am I feeling? How does everybody relate to me and like me and so forth, you know? And they're all ego games. They really are. Because you're a value without any of those. But when you've played those mental games for many years, you really don't know how not to do it. So remember, I'm not saying attack it the way we used to do dirty thoughts. Remember, I had dirty thoughts. I'm not telling you attack, I'm saying observe it. That's all. The observing is actually more effective than the attacking. Did you know that? To attack something actually engages it in a negative way. It's the attraction of forbidden fruit. The generations of teenage boys we condemn to by attacking their so-called dirty thoughts that only engaged them at a deeper level. No, you observe it and you see what you're doing. And you have to stand over here and see it and see that it's sort of useless. It's on a mental trip. But if you can't see that, you will be trapped by it. So that's early stage contemplation. Now, if God wants to get at you, if God wants to get through your barriers and your blockages, at that point, God has the best chance of doing it. Quite simply because finally you're out of the way. With your ego, your judgments, your fears, your angers, your attachment to your own self-image. And it will have a lot to do with attachments. Attachments to feelings, attachments to thoughts, attachments to self-image. And you won't know how attached you are to those things normally until they're taken from you. That's why the mystics and saints talk so much about the necessity of suffering. That when things are taken from you, let's say just your dignity is taken from you. One of the interns spoke to you this morning. And so you walk down the street chafing, just chafing. Why don't they like me? And I knew they all think they're better than I. And the mind just goes on, and that's all your false self, trying to protect itself. But you'll actually be able to thank God for that when you recognize that you would never have seen how much your false self is in control today if not for that humiliation. So basically, and I got this from Thomas Keating, although I totally believe it, he says he now charts the path of conversion as a series of necessary humiliations to the false self. It's that simple. That's what conversion is. This thing doesn't whine. There's nothing to whine about. It's too satisfied. It's too content. It's too happy. Jesus says this is the peace the world cannot give. This is the joy the world cannot take from you. The most common verb, by the way, used by the mystics is rest. This self can rest because it's home free. There's nothing to prove. There's nothing to protect. I don't have to pretend. There's nothing to live up to. I've already, do you understand? I've already got the conclusion. I'm not going to go to heaven. It's heaven all the way to heaven. I think an experience of God is necessary for mental and emotional health. This is just a little more continuation. The false self, as you'll see here, maintains itself by performance, the performance principle. Paul calls it the law, by requirements. So I would call the false self a relative identity. I would call the true self your absolute identity. The true self will be a prayer. The true self can contemplate. The relative identity is not bad. The false self is not the bad self. It's simply, now listen closely, it's simply not the true self. Got it? It's not the bad self. This is not bad. It's simply not this. Now the trouble is when you think this is all you have. And that's what most people, this is all they have. They never knew they had access to this. They never knew they were spiritual beings trying to become human. They think they're human beings trying to become spiritual, all right? This is the only thing worthy of being called the good news. What else would be good news? This is good news. This really is bad news. It's terrible news. Because all you can do is live by the performance principle here. And you know what? Paul says in Romans, the law will always kill you. The law is his word for the performance principle. Well, that's why teachers like Jesus push that seeing all the way to the edge, to try to see the divine image, especially in those people that you wouldn't be naturally attracted to. Maybe people who are a little smelly or a little ugly or dying or not so physically attractive or handicapped or something like that, or not in your group. The spiritual teacher has to push you to the edge, because once you can see it there, then the seeing has been achieved. Once you can recognize the divine image where you don't want to see the divine image, then you've learned how to see. It's really that simple. And here's the rub. It's not you that's doing the seeing. It's like there's another pair of eyes inside of you, seeing through you, seeing with you, seeing in you. And all you can do is get out of the way. Now that's what you're doing at your 20-minute sit. You're getting out of the way. And the main thing you got to get out of the way is your mind. It took me years to recognize that. At first to people it seems like an overstatement, like putting too much blame on the mind. But in fact, it is the mind that keeps defining the self, engineering and manufacturing futures, and worrying about past mistakes, replaying past wounds and so forth, over and over again. We now think that 90% of human thought, although some say 96%, I don't know, that matters a great deal, is repetitive and useless. It just keeps thinking the same things over and over again. That's something. And by the time you're my age, it's even worse, because you've got 2 or 3 neural grooves that you've grown used to, and you just replay every event through those same 3 responses. That's why a lot of old people, frankly, I love old people, but if they haven't done their inner work, most old people are not much fun to be around. And you know that. Because they've got 4 stayed responses. And those are the same responses to everything. What you see in the contemplative mind is a freshness of response, an originality of response, an originality of seeing, which I guess means you have to incorporate some of the right brain. The reason I can stand here and talk the way I do is because I'm so dang left brain. And that's probably why I recognize the need for the limiting of this left brain. Although both of them can be equally problematic in terms of defining the self. It's especially the left brain, whereby we keep trying to make life linear, make life logical, and make it tit for tat and quid pro quo, instead of simply bearing the mystery of it. And once you bear the mystery of it, which is what the contemplative mind does, it's not looking for logic. It's not looking for quid pro quo, 2 + 2 = 4. That isn't important anymore. It's just to hold it in the death and in the resurrection, and to allow them to somehow coexist. So contemplation, let's just draw it together on this, is meeting reality in its most simple and immediate form. Now, to meet reality in its most simple and immediate form, the only way you can do that is you've got to get rid of your mental grids, your mental ways of judging, critiquing, computing, everything. That's why the mind has to be somehow placed to the side. So I'm going to say that every major religion at its more mature levels is trying to give you some kind of method to compartmentalize the mind, to put the mind to the side. Now what they found out is things like mantras, chants, anything you repeat has that effect. Also, moving into the body. That's why things like breathing or pilgrimage can also stop the mind. Or runners say running too. But prayer beads are not unique to the rosary in Catholicism. If you've been to Asia, you find them all over Asia. If you go to the Islamic world, you'll see people on the streets with their prayer beads all over. Every religion has discovered that. Only Protestantism, which came along far too late in history, when we were really getting into the head and into sermons and words and Bible quotes and everything, it didn't understand that anymore. And it's probably the only major world religion that doesn't have something like prayer beads or chants to break you and free you from this addictive pattern of thinking. So isn't it funny that, Descartes probably is the nadir of Western philosophy. And he says, the French philosopher, I think, therefore I am. And here we would come along now and say, it's precisely, I think, therefore I'm not. We'd say it's your thinking that keeps you in this. Huh? It's your non-thinking at the level of pure presence. And presence cannot be thought. Try it. If you don't have any training in giving up the head, I don't think you'll ever experience being. And it becomes a way of life. So I don't like to think of it so much as something you do as something you are. And so I often use the phrase the contemplative stance. It's a stance. It's a way of living and moving and walking and being in this world. Even though I fully admit that we don't live all our 24 hours there. I certainly don't. The world keeps pulling you back into the false self. Put on this hat. Put on this identity. Take on this hurt. Put on this self-importance. And we all do it. And it's all right as long as you know how to take it back off. Do you follow me? And don't wear it too long. Any image. And the more positive one you have, the more dangerous it is. That's why I can't wear my Franciscan habit or priest clothes too much. It's too strong a self-image that then you have to live up to. But you can all have those. Let's say some of you have a high degree, or you're a mother of 6 children, or the more grandiose it is, the more glorious it is, the more dangerous it is. Or if you're well known or anything like that, then you tend to get more attached to it. But what we found out, and this is surprise of surprises, is that the ego is equally attached to a negative self-image. It took us a long time to recognize what we called scrupulous people who would come to confession almost every Saturday afternoon, were actually egocentric people. That they have to feel worthy or unworthy. They have to have some definition rather than to just be. Just nothingness, just emptiness, just I am who I am in God, nothing more and nothing less, and that's everything. That is a hard place to live. You have to be taught how to live here, because there's no positive or negative way you can dress yourself up. And we know now people would sooner think of themselves as sinners or bad or inferior. That gives them something to fight. Do you understand? Something to oppose, rather than to live in the emptiness. So that's the language. Buddhists use emptiness. Franciscans, we use the word poverty. Carmelites use the word nothingness. The New Testament Jesus word is the desert. It's all about going to a place that at first feels like no thing. Nothing. There's nothing. This is why it's so hard to sell. It's so hard for me to talk about it even here. It's unprovable. It's unmeasurable. It's unpredictable. It's just pure being. And if you can't live at that level of pure being, if you constantly need a product or a performance or some kind of test, you won't know how to live there. That is the language of the mystics. I just gave you the key. You can open up any mystic now. and they'll make sense to you. That's the way they're talking all the time. And if you're living at the level of capitalist consumerism, where everything is product and achievement and performance, and who am I, and what shingle can I hang, on my forehead, or what name can I give myself, you won't know how to go there. So all great spirituality, certainly contemplative spirituality, is about letting go. Letting go of what you don't need. Don't need this, don't need that. And in that, normally, you collapse back into this. And it only needs to happen once. Once you know this, you'll never be satisfied with anything less. This is what you were created for, because this is who you are. And you know you found it then. And then the future, ironically, will be different. Because you're going to bring a different self, a transformed self, a contemplative self, to those new situations. So this, more than anything else, brothers and sisters, is why we founded the center 15 years ago.